The journey to React 19 has been wild, to put it lightly. There has been so much work going into this release, everything from the new server component patterns to all the crazy stuff with use transition to the ways they kind of broke Suspense, but not really. It's been a journey, but we're at the end of it, and React 19 is finally stable and ready to use today. Not that you couldn't use it before. I'm sure a lot of us were on Next.js and taking advantage of the Canary with App Router and Server. You get the point. It's actually officially stable now, and there are some changes that are really important to understand. So if you use React, make sure you stick around. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is Bolt.new, and I actually already shot this ad, and I threw it away because I just learned something that I think's more important than all of the other stuff I've recorded. If you don't already know, Bolt.new is the quick way to spin up an app using AI and actually prompt and have a whole editor in the browser. It's by the people over at Stackblitz. They know how to make a good editor in the browser, and it is one of the best ways to start your new app today. What I didn't realize is the entire thing is open source. What? Why did no one tell me this? Whole thing, prompts and all, they're not hiding it. So if you don't want to pay, you can go self-host it and do whatever you want. I've even seen people forking it and throwing it on Docker. But I just think it's really, really cool that you can go in and actually understand how it's generating your code. That makes it so much more trustworthy than all of the similar tools, in my opinion. Like, I'm a cursor guy. It's closed source. I don't know how it's generating stuff. Here, you can go see every single little bit. And it's not like it just starts apps in one specific way that they like. You can tell it to start an Astro app, a Remix app, a Svelte app. I think you can even tell it to do a Python app. It knows what it's doing. It can even make presentations with SlideDev. And when you want to deploy, you just tell it to deploy and it does it automatically for you on Netlify. I've been really happy with both. It's been a super fun way to start building your apps, and you should give it a shot if you haven't. Check them out today at soydev.link/bolt, or you can just go to bolt.new. React 19 is now stable. For what it's worth, most of this post is the same as the release candidate post back in April. I have a whole video about that if you haven't seen it. Kind of crazy to think it's been since April that the release candidate came out, but we're through it. It's here. Let's focus on the important new pieces, which are improvements to Suspense and the React DOM static APIs, both of which are really cool. The Suspense changes are what held up the React 19 release. To quickly TLDR, Suspense is a way to have a good fallback state when components are doing things that are asynchronous, be it fetching data, generating things that require an async call, just things that you don't want to block your main thread for. Previously, the way Suspense worked is it would try to render all of the components, go through all of the children one at a time. Once it was done, it would check to see if any of them were waiting for things. And if they were, it would throw into the fallback state, which is, in this case, just a loading div. The problem was it had to go through all of the subcomponents and start their renders before you could get to the loading state. React 19 originally introduced a change where it would go through these components one at a time until it found one that needed data or something that it was blocking on, and it would immediately go back up and throw the fallback, and then go through the rest of the components one at a time. The problem is that means all of these aren't being kicked off at the same time. Back in React 18, this would have taken 3 seconds to render roughly, because all three of these components would have started at the same time. So this timer, and this timer are all going together in parallel. Because of how Facebook uses React, they fetch all of their data at once when the page loads. So having to wait for all of the components was causing the fallback behavior to be slower. So they decided to just stop once the first component is hit and not start the next ones. But if you're using React and Suspense in a way where you actually want to kick off all of these things at once, the performance was really bad. Most people aren't using Suspense at all, to be fair. But the ones who were not using it too often in that way. I know if you're heavy on things like use Suspense query and React query or deep in the React 3 Fiber world, you might be using it for really cool stuff. And if you are doing those things, this was a really, really bad change. There was a bunch of outrage. I have a long video detailing all of that, but we finally have a resolution. Now in React 19, when a component suspends, React will immediately commit the fallback of the nearest suspense boundary without waiting for the entire sibling tree to render. That's the change I was talking about before, but they added to it. After the fallback commits, React schedules another render for the suspended siblings to pre-warm lazy requests in the rest of the tree. What this means is, after it realizes here, oh, this is suspending, throw the fallback, then go through and kick off the rest of the children for their renders. That allows you to get basically the exact same performance while also getting the fallback state much earlier, which is an awesome change for us Suspense nerds. This primarily benefits big code bases with giant components, especially those that are heavily using Suspense. Most of you don't have to worry about this, but it's awesome that they found a compromise here that allows for a code base like Facebook's to be as performant as possible, while also allowing for us to use it for crazy things like we see in React 3 Fiber. And as they show here, you had to wait for all of the children before you could see the loading state. Now, as soon as one child suspends, you see the loading state and the rest start to get rendered. This change means that the suspense fallback displays faster while still warming lazy requests in the suspended tree. This change took a while for them to get right, to get tested everywhere they wanted it to, and this is the change that blocked React 19. It's here, it works. They released a GA of this a few weeks ago. Everyone seems happy. I haven't seen anyone complain just yet, so I hope this is the end of the suspense drama. What a suspenseful event it has been. Just to show this is a very good change, Dominic, who is the lead maintainer for React Query and TanStack Query, did a quick demo using the new version of Suspense in React 19, said it's not quite the same as it was in V18, but it is definitely the perfect trade-off. He was very happy with the results. So he said, start fetch 1, then start fetch 2, render fallback. Both fetches used to start at the same time. React 19 would render the fallback after fetch 1, wait, and then start fetch 2. Now it starts fetch 1, renders the fallback, and then right after kicks off fetch 2. You get the fallback faster, and you don't have to wait for the finish. Awesome. A++. We're going to cover the other big change quick, and then we're going to do a higher level why you should care about React 19. The other big change here is that React DOM static has a couple new helpers for static site generators, pre-render and pre-render to node stream. These new APIs improve on render to string by waiting for data to load for static HTML generation. They're designed to work with streaming environments like nodes, streams, and web streams. For example, in a web stream environment, you can pre-render a React tree to static HTML now using pre-render. So here we call the pre-render function from React DOM static. We pass it our app JSX component for our app. We give it any bootstrap scripts that it requires for things that it does. We get our prelude, which is the response that we want to send to the user, and then we can return that as HTML. Pre-render APIs will wait for all data to load before returning the static HTML stream. Streams can be converted to strings or sent with a streaming response. They do not support streaming content as it loads, which is supported by the existing React DOM server rendering APIs. This is really cool because it allows you to do like a static HTML pre-render or even like generate something like a blog that doesn't need React code at all in it, in the client side at least, but you're still able to use React on the server. Kind of gives you all of the benefits that you're looking for. Really nice win. And I've seen some really crazy stuff going on with this. So previously, if you wanted to use React on the server like this, you had to use their pre-render function from the React DOM server package, which presumes that it can resume the results on the client side, which isn't always the case. And you'll see it still has the prelude and postponed concept where the prelude is the first thing it responds with, the postponed is what comes after. Nice that these things are accessible in places that aren't just the crazy server component world. Like everyone should be able to pre-render their stuff, and there's a lot of places this would be very beneficial. And since it's a static thing, you can now run this in something like your build instead of having to use this for a server rendered thing. Very nice. These pieces are going to make it a lot easier for people to make their own. I don't want to encourage this, but you can kind of more easily make your own bespoke framework light around what these primitives offer. And I'm really excited to see more bespoke React frameworks popping up, taking advantage of these things. Ooh. We have Sebastian Lorber here, who is planning on using this for SSG and Docusaurus. I also saw that you now have an RS pack option for Docusaurus. That's really cool to see. Great work on all that. Docusaurus is still one of the best options for documentation. Yeah, there's no render to string equivalent in React 18. Very good context to have. Render to string was always a bit slow, but it's good to see that we can get around all of these things. I certainly talked about this in the previous video, but it's so nice that we finally can get way better diffs when we have hydration errors. Hydration errors are the worst. I totally understand why people want to leave React when they run into them for the first time. Now we get way better errors where it says why it thinks the thing happened, why the branch between server and client may have occurred in the specific diff that it sees in the HTML. Really, really nice for the weird cases where your server and your client render things slightly differently. Hopefully by now you have a rough idea of what React 19 specifically is adding, but I want to talk more about the mindset shift that React 19 represents. Back in the day, when we built something with React, it would look something like this, where we had our HTML, had a head, it would load some script, it would have a different metadata in it, like your title, stuff like that on the head. And then your body would have an ID root, or even more commonly, app. And one of these scripts would be script source equals app bundle.js. So when you actually went to this website, it would have to fetch all of the things you have up here, all the CSS, all the script tags, and show you whatever the default state is in your body. until the JS loads and then can come in and take over from here. React didn't start until the page had loaded, the JS had loaded, been parsed and run, and then you were actually using React. Next.js had the goal of taking over this part and giving it a bit more of a relationship with the React code. Let's say you have a specific route that needs a different title. Like on Twitch, when you go to my channel, it should have different data in the head tag. So when you send that link to somebody, it can correctly embed the metadata in the Discord message, the tweet, whatever else, using the right info for that specific page. Previously, this concern largely existed outside of React's area. And that's why something like Next was so important, because it allowed you to control those things on a per route basis while using that alongside React. That was nice, but it was really like a one-way relationship where it was like Next.js wrapped the HTML, which wrapped the React. So if we were to diagram this, it's kind of like we had HTML and then a smaller circle in here, which was React. But the HTML was just the container that the React was in. React had no control of it, but we needed more control of the HTML. So new tools like Next.js were made in order to give us that extra control, also to fix the woes that were our bundle and everything else alongside that. Over time, we've realized that this isn't ideal because it's very one way. Next.js can do things outside of React's bubble, but all it can really do is create the pages in the environment. It can't really interop with the React part on the inside. The perfect example of how this worked is something like get server-side props, where you would have a function in a specific route on your code base that would generate data, and it would pass that to the top of the React app that you would then have to pass down component by component. But the idea of something within React having access to something from Next wasn't real. The only way a given component could get something from Next is if you passed it to the root, and then it went through all the way down to that component. If you open up any page router app using Next, you'll see there's a little Next data tag that gets embedded in the HTML that has all of those page props, so that if a component tries to access them, it has access there to then pass it through the React app. But literally what is happening here is Next.js puts a script tag in HTML, and then the React code is told to fetch that data from that point in the HTML. There is no relationship between these. They can't pass things back and forth. It's literally just the prop from Next being embedded in the HTML so that React can access it, kind of like passes down back to React. But there is no way for the React code to go back up and request different things, request an update, and really do much of anything. It's just that Next sends things to the HTML that then React has access to. The new model is fundamentally different here in a way that's really exciting. And honestly, I can't really think of how to diagram it because it's kind of like React is just at all of the levels now. So if I was to do this the like complex literal way, it would be kind of like I put another circle out here that is also React. But I don't think this is a fair way to think about it. This is what it seems like when you first discover all these new tools and technologies, that React is now this greater thing on the outside that controls your server and changes how everything works. But I think of it a bit differently. I think of server components and this whole new way of building almost like a bridge between the parts. So we have this path that's been made between the server side, the HTML that the user gets, and the React side. Examples of how this works are things like the power of static rendering a component for your shell, the unique capabilities we get with streaming, where you can send down whatever is done immediately and then stream the rest in later, which fits like the HTML layer, and then all of the power around the like passing something that only runs on the server down to the client. My favorite demo, and I have it in this project actually. So here we have your classic tab component. We've all seen these in docs where you have tab A, B, and C. You can click to swap between the three. If we look at the code, things are going to be a bit interesting. We have the page component, which doesn't have use client, which means it's a server component by default. Now, when we look here, we have my tab wrapper component that I imported, and I'm passing it tab contents, tab is A, tab is B, and tab is C. So you would expect all of these to be logged there because I'm passing these components down. So when the React code renders on the client, that means it has to console log those, right? Kind of. They made a nice change where the logs on the server now get passed to the client so you can see them. But in production, you wouldn't get these logs because in production, this code doesn't run on the client, and it doesn't run on the client here either. These logs are coming from the server because all three of those components get rendered on the server, and then their results are passed down so that React can swap between them on the client side. You can pass a server component's rendered output as a prop to a client component and then use client-side state to swap between those different server-rendered states. This type of thing is what makes the new React model so special. It's not just adding a couple features here and there to patch these broken parts. It's rethinking how React interfaces with all of these other things. The way I kind of think of this, and it's going to make very little sense, and I'm going to apologize in advance. The first thing I would change is I'd put client in the middle here, not React, although obviously the client JS is running React. But what React now thinks about is what subset of all of this can it provide the happiest path to so that the other half is way less complex. I've almost felt all of these circles shrink as a result of how these new patterns work, where a lot of things I would have to do to like generate a static shell for the different pages I had, render something on the server and only pass down the parts I want to the client. All of these things required so many hacks and so much weird just weirdness with your JS. That's all gone. With that, the model is now very different, and we have to think differently about how we write our React. There were so many patterns and paradigms and ways of building that we had to do these ways because of the complexity around React. Like I know at Twitch, we had a Go service that would generate the different HTML shells for different routes that would all just load the same React code in the end. You might look at this and think it doesn't benefit you and something like server components doesn't matter because you're rendering everything on client. Hear me out for just 1 second. Let's say your page wasn't just this tab wrapper. Let's pretend it has a lot more stuff that it needs. Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to wait for all that JS to come in to then tell the browser everything else it needs? Like let's say this component has a specific font it needs or some CSS it has to load. If we use server components literally just as a top level static wrapper and send everything else down on the client when it's ready, you can basically move any existing React app to this pattern, have a slightly better static shell that allows you to stream quicker and start fetching things like the fonts a little bit earlier. Previously, you'd have to wait for the whole HTML to load. Then it would kick off the JS load. If it had the CSS embedded in there, awesome, it can start. If not, it has to wait for React to then figure out what CSS it needs. You end up waiting for the HTML, then for React to load and run and identify what it needs. Often it has to load additional bundles. Then you have to wait for it to add the right tags into the page to fetch things like your CSS, like your fonts, like all this other stuff, while at the same time the content is starting to render. With this model, React can hoist all of those depths up so that they're in the HTML tag as soon as the page loads, and then everything else comes in when it's ready. This doesn't mean you have to run React on the server. This is one of the most common misconceptions with server components, is the idea that it has to run on a server whenever you go to the page. There's a very real future coming where you can static render the server components, where instead of thinking of a server component as a thing that runs on the server, you could think of it as a different place that React was rendered in. Technically, your dev machine is a server. So when you run npm run build on your machine, you are running those server components on your device as a server. And now you have those static pieces that come in on the client side when it's ready. That is a really powerful thing. The idea of server components, not just as the thing that you use with Next.js when you run React on the server, but as React being the piece that generates the HTML layer. It's taken React's area of concern, it expanded it slightly, but it allows us to do the right thing for the user much more easily and to not have to patch that in with a ton of other tools. I've seen some chaotic stuff of people brute forcing pre-rendering into React by doing things like spinning up the server, hitting it via Puppeteer or Playwright, saving the HTML response, and then using that as the static site. Even frameworks like Remix used to recommend this strategy as the way of building your static parts of your React site. The reality is that every website has some things that are static and some things that are dynamic. React used to only care about the dynamic parts and making those as easy to work with as possible. And the reason for that was just that the dynamic parts were hard to do at the time. When React happened, static had been figured out. We were deep in PHP and we were more than happy. But jQuery was the wrong way to do the dynamic parts. It was better than what we had, but it wasn't good enough. React made dynamic great. It made it so great that static started to fall behind. And the thing that's changed here, the real mental model shift, is that React isn't just concerned about the dynamic part anymore. It's concerned about the holistic set of pieces that have to come together to make the experience great. They're not prescribing every solution to every one of those parts, but they're giving us what we need to assemble it how we want. That's why things like the static APIs are so useful, because this shows that they're building ways for us to take advantage of this mindset and these new benefits of React without having to adopt something like Next.js. Yeah. As Sebastian said here, Remix and React Router 7 do have pre-rendering, and in the implementation, it's surprising, but they spawn a server and send real requests to it to generate the HTML. That is how we've had to do this for a while, but the advantage of these new APIs is you could do this without all those weird hacks, and the amount of those hacks that have made it into production, the majority of like Fortune 500 React sites are probably doing something like that. There's even a famous story of Netflix removing React. What they actually did is they rendered the React app for their sign-in page on the server, filled in a little bit of JS to make the form active, and now they're sending almost no JS to get started with Netflix, which helped them improve load times on the first page. Once you're actually in the Netflix app, obviously they're using React for everything there. But since they built their own crazy pre-rendering, you get that homepage faster. And as I said here, it was only for the landing page, and they still used React. The point being, you can do a lot better now, and React not being client only might frustrate people because they don't think of React as an HTML generator or a server-side framework or any of the other things. But the reality is JavaScript providing a good experience for the user requires the right things being done on the server layer, the data layer, and the HTML that the browser actually gets. Now these are all pieces that React is thinking about and giving us solutions to. That is a really nice shift, and the results that are coming from it have been awesome. That said, I know a lot of people are concerned that this means React is leaving the client and focusing more on the server and the static rendering, the pre-rendering, data fetching, all of those parts. I couldn't be more certain you're wrong, and there's one really big reason for it. Here is my proof. See how this has literally no lag? That's because of a new thing that makes React on the client significantly better. The React compiler. The React compiler efforts are entirely client-focused. These don't benefit any of the server or pre-render or any of those parts at all. This just makes the client experience faster. If I turn off the plugin and we go back here, look at the lag. See how far behind that falls, even though I'm on a really beefy M2 Max computer here. Since I'm updating that state and every state update is causing this slow component to re-render, this now lags terribly. And all you have to do to fix these types of things now is use the new compiler, which is built around React 19. Thankfully, they somehow got it to support 18 as well. Really cool they did that. But I want to make sure you guys understand that the React team isn't just leaving behind client. This app here is a Vite app. It has no concept of server components at all. You basically couldn't really do server components until Vite v6, which just dropped. The point being, these demos work well on client apps because these benefits are huge for everyone. Yes, this is a great way of phrasing how the build stuff works, Edward. It's like the components are being made before the page is deployed. They're being made in the build process. You could do this with static rendering in Next.js, but it would have to render the whole thing. The idea of partially rendering a shell, having some pieces that get passed down and then the components can render. The big thing you couldn't do before is if you had a client component that needed something, you couldn't pass it something statically rendered on the server. Let's say like if I had my tab demo here, and this tab wrapper component was slow for some reason. Like I had to fetch some data, I had to do something on the client side, so it couldn't be part of that static render. We can still static render the tab contents, the things that we're passing it as props. So we can have that be built at build time, and then on the client, this gets loaded on the client, and these static pieces get passed down as part of the actual build output, which is so cool. We no longer have to have the static part go up until div ID equals app, which is what it was before. If we look back at the old way of doing things, Next would allow us to make the HTML static up until a certain point in our DOM, and as soon as something was dynamic enough that we didn't want in our static bundle, everything underneath it had to be similarly dynamic. That sucked. That was not great. And I've had to do so many crazy hacks in order to make sure the static parts can be static and the dynamic parts don't block it. That's just kind of gone now. And once this interweaving thing locks in your head and you realize what the new model enables in terms of the relationship between static parts, dynamic server-side parts, and client parts, it all comes together in admittedly a little bit of a mess, but a really, really powerful one that reduces the amount of complexity in how you build significantly. Every time I go back and look at something I built the old way, I find a bunch of hacks I did to try to force in behaviors like this. Now that's not a problem. And the compiler is very similar in that way. The compiler is taking things that we had to hack around that made the React experience, I would argue, just worse. Like if I wanted to take these demo components and make everything work the same way React compiler did, I think I had to add 5 memo calls to these 3 components. I had to memoize props, I had to memoize functions, I had to do a bunch of use callbacks, and it made the React code much harder to reason about. Even though I was writing better code in the sense it was the correct code, I was writing worse code in the maintainability, and any small change could have broken it. Keep an eye out for the video all about React compiler and the re-render problem, coming very soon. But it's important to understand how much worse the code you had to write was to do the right thing for the user. If I memoize color picker, it doesn't matter because I'm inlining this here. So in order for this to work properly, I would have to wrap that in a use callback. I would also have to do it up here because if I pass this anonymous function, that gets redefined on every render. If I take this same code and throw it in the playground for the React compiler, you'll see it has this weird $ syntax. Sorry, those of you using jQuery alongside React compiler. What it's doing here is memoizing every single piece so it doesn't have to be revalidated on every re-render. You could write code like this. You'd probably write it with more use memo, use callback instead of all of this chaos. The point is that you shouldn't have to write this code because it makes the experience of authoring, building, maintaining, code reviewing, and everything else significantly worse. What I only recently realized is that this is what the new React model on the server is doing too. The goal is to take all the hacks we had to do these types of pre-rendering things and just make it not necessary. It's destroyed a whole dimension of problems. That's always been what React did. React would take the way we built, look at the edge cases and how rough they were making our lives, and figure out what it would take to not have those cases exist at all. Good engineers write bugs, great engineers patch bugs, 10x engineers make them impossible to happen in the first place. And that's what I'm excited about here. As much as React made weird states hard on the client, it didn't solve the client-server problem. Now it's given us the pieces to solve it how we need, using as much or as little as possible to build the best possible thing for our users without making the code unmaintainable for anyone other than a wizard. I am so happy with this release and what it enables for the React ecosystem and for the web as a whole. And don't forget about React Native because they get some real cool benefits here too. That's all I have to say for now. Keep an eye out for the server components on mobile video, as well as the React re-render video, all coming very soon. Make sure you're subbed if you're not. Until next time, peace nerds.